My name is Daniel Stockin. I'm a public health professional. I'm a career public health person. I got pulled into the water fluoridation issue about 6.5 years ago when my boss got a skin rash on her arm. She asked me, she's very intuitive by nature, and she said, is it possible that this fluoridated water that I'm drinking and showering in could it be causing this skin rash that the doctors can't seem to get rid of? And so I did what I've done hundreds of times in my career. I just kind of back away from a chemical and look at how your body metabolizes it and what the target organs are, et cetera. And when I looked into this chemical fluoride, I mean, I had even worked with fluoride chemicals, some pretty dangerous ones. I had been involved in assessing and doing some work related to them. But I had never really looked at this water fluoridation issue and the chemical fluoride compounds that are used in the water. And when I looked into it, my jaw just hit the ground. And I saw all this information that was there. This was really a no-brainer. And so I went to my boss and I said, you know, this is what I learned. And she was amazed, and we both were. And she told me that she didn't feel it was morally right for us to take steps to protect our own families and not to care about the other people around us. So she said, I don't know who you have to talk to, get it turned off. And so I was very green to this idea. I'm not a politician by trade or anything, and but I can tell when someone's trying to blow smoke past me on chemicals. And so I started thinking, well, I'll just talk to some people and see what happens. And I thought maybe this is a 5% of my time project for a few weeks. I was very green, I don't know. And suddenly the thing mushroomed almost overnight to where I was basically full-time at this thing, and it grew very quickly. And I began to receive correspondence from all over the planet and began to find out that this really was an issue that seemed to have a growing momentum to it. The first thing I found out is that most public health people and medical professionals don't know the basics, the fundamental issues about harm from fluorides. And that was pretty surprising for me. And I began to get some very disappointing reactions from my peers and colleagues in the public health field. And I began to see that they would jump through these contortions to continue justifying adding fluoride to drinking water. And it didn't make any sense to me because this was such an obvious situation where you can't control the dose and the chemical has effects throughout the body. So why would we be adding this to drinking water with people drinking it in unmeasured amounts? I was surprised that the public health community and the medical community was resisting this. I also found that legislators didn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. And I even had one legislator, he told me, you know, he said he'd been dealing, we gave him a bunch of information, and he began to look into it. Then he began to get the resistance. And so then he told me that these folks from the Dental Society had told him that they had formed a dossier on me and my boss, and I really don't care. They can form a dossier on me. But I was just sort of surprised at the pushback from people who you would think it was their job to look out for the public interest. And we haven't had the opposition where, you know, kind of overt, yeah, we've had some people say we're strange and weird and that kind of thing. And of course, for me that was odd because I was the guy that people wanted to come clean up their chemical messes and assess the safety of chemicals and biologic agents and things like that in their work environment. So now all of a sudden people are saying, well, yeah, you did that, you used to do these things, but now we don't believe you when you're talking to us about fluorides. That's not something unique. Frankly, a lot of people who are resisting or wanting to end water fluoridation, they get resistance and they're called names, and so that's not unique. But it has been part of our experience that the resistance, it's a kind of resistance that's not so much overt as it is they question your credibility, they question your information that you have, and they even question common sense, which for me was really strange. I mean, I can understand if there was an issue with a real questionable issue of nuances about a chemical's properties and things like this. But the fundamental issues about dose and exposure and susceptible populations, these were not difficult concepts certainly for the health-trained and the science-trained people to deal with. So what I found out really is that people are not dealing with this in an intellectually honest manner and in a scientific manner. politics, emotion, money, other things like this get involved. I find that people really, as I mentioned before, they go through these contortions to continue justifying adding fluoride when we now know the primary effect is topical, not through systemic absorption. And now that we know that people are getting it from so many different sources, meaning in their foods and medications and in residues from pesticides and fumigants and things like this, there's just, it's a thing that I call multiple source overdosing. And you know, this is not rocket science. This is real basic common sense. We sort of have this idea that they would never let us be exposed to certain kinds of things. There's this idea that they watch out for us. And I found that even amongst toxicologists and people who have really hardcore, heavy science, chemistry training and things like this, they leave behind some of the really basic tenets that are so basic and fundamental to assessing toxic effect. And you know, the margin of safety in fluoridation is really strange, where for instance, the maximum amount that's allowed in water in the US at the moment is 4 parts per million. There is no safe level for drinking water to put fluoride in there artificially. It makes no sense, because you cannot control the amount of the water that people are going to drink. You're going to have some people who drink 4 to 5 or 6 times more than someone else. You're also going to have some people whose body weight is double or triple that of other people who are drinking it. The very idea that you can give uncontrolled, unmeasured amounts of a substance that bioaccumulates in your body over your lifetime to people of varying medical susceptibilities and unknown medical histories makes absolutely no sense. This violates all the basic fundamental tenets of modern pharmacology and toxicology. It's kind of a little bit sad for me. It's a little bit sad when I find dentists, first of all, they're not allowed to practice in an area that's not their expertise, and they can't make statements about other areas of the body and how your body will react, and various organ systems outside the mouth will react to fluorides. And I have found dentists who really don't, many dentists who don't understand that they're treading on really thin ice. But when they talk about, oh, it's safe. Well, I would expect a dentist can talk to me some about what happens in the tissues and things inside my mouth. But it doesn't make any sense, obviously, for people with oral health training to make inferences or direct statements that my kidneys are not impacted by this, when they don't know even the basic information about kidney impacts. And they certainly don't know my medical history, and they don't know all these other things that might affect my health. So I find that there are some dentists, though, that have sort of gotten it about fluoride, but very few of them will speak out. There's just this inordinate amount of pressure from the dental societies and the dental infrastructure to keep people on the talking points about fluoride. Don't go beyond the talking points, and trust your dental society, trust the people, your peers and your grad school teachers. And it's very disturbing for me as a public health person, but you know, I'm not a doctor, I don't pretend to be, but I can tell when someone's talked to me about issues of toxics assessment and chemical exposures. I can tell when, based on my career background and my training, that I can see when people are speaking out of school, when they're speaking beyond their level of knowledge. And I have found virtually, well, very few people in the dental arena, and even physicians, who know the most up-to-date information, the toxic data, the tox data, and some of the other information that's coming out from all around the world. It's hard enough. I mean, I don't kid myself. I know what it's like to try to keep up with literature just in a certain discipline. And you know, it's hard for doctors. They've got all kinds of things coming at them. So I understand that they can't understand and know everything. But there's some basic fundamental things that they shouldn't set aside when they're looking at this. I've seen that when we get in the room with people who are promoting fluoridation, very often they wind up embarrassing themselves. And I hate to do that. It's never my intention. I shouldn't say it's never my intention. Occasionally there are people that just need to be embarrassed, but that's not my personality to want to just embarrass people. But after repeated efforts to educate them, they've continued to just stonewall and not look at the information, and they want to stick their head in the sand. I have no heartburn if they wind up embarrassing themselves. I'll give you an example of what happened. One time I was in a meeting at a city council, and a state dental officer came in, and one of the city council people said, and this is on tape, I mean, they said, where are we getting the fluoride that we're using? And this dentist said, who was a dental officer for the state, said, I don't know. Well, that wasn't true because I had already given the information to the person. And then they said, well, you don't know. She said, so you're not aware that the fluoride we're using is the collected air emissions of the phosphate fertilizer industry, and you're the state dental officer, and you don't know this stuff, where the fluoride comes from? You could have heard a pin drop in the council chambers. It was, when I think back on it, it was this electric moment. You know, the incredulity that was expressed by the council representative that a state dental person who's paid and has responsibility to know this kind of information didn't know that information. It was so illustrative to me of the vast amount of ignorance which is in the medical and dental communities, which has allowed fluoridation to continue. Why is that? Because people don't have the time, sometimes don't have the interest either, to want to know this information for themselves. They want to believe the experts, the people that trained them. And what I've come to find out is that, and this is a disturbing thing to hear, but for every citizen that hears this, they have to understand our doctors, our dentists make big mistakes sometimes, big ones. And our government regulatory agencies make huge mistakes sometimes, and sometimes they don't get called on the carpet, but sometimes they do. So this has been something that I think we're going to see more and more of, that doctors and dentists, who are not the enemy, by the way, they're not. I mean, I think that there's other groups of people who are actively working that the primary people is not necessarily to blame the doctors and dentists. Having said that though, there's some real fundamental things that a doctor should recognize instantly, things about uncontrolled dose, things about enhanced susceptibility for certain population groups like diabetics and kidney patients, things like that. They need to know that information. One of the things at the Lilly Center that we began to focus on was disproportionate harm by fluorides to minorities, particularly Black Americans. We got interested in this when we began to look at some of the information that was coming out from the Centers for Disease Control. Back in 2005, they published in their MMWR publication some of their own information on a number of oral health issues and developments. And one of the things was that they talked about dental fluorosis, this teeth staining and pitting that's caused by overexposure to fluorides as a young child. And there's a chart. Now in this particular MMWR publication, it was a lengthy paper in there, and it had a whole boatload of charts and diagrams. Well, buried in the very back, in the very last, I think 23rd out of 23 charts, is this little bit of information that talked about the amount of increase in dental fluorosis that had happened relatively recently compared to the previous look-see at it. And they found out that they were describing the amount of dental fluorosis of various conditions, meaning very mild, moderate, or severe, in different racial groups. And I looked at this and my eyes just opened up really wide, and I saw that there was significantly more of this dental fluorosis disfigurement happening in Black Americans. And so I began to look to see, well, had anybody bothered to share this with the Black community? And it was very sad to see that no, there really wasn't an effort to share this. And it's not just the Black community, it's also Hispanics and other groups. But we began to sort of reach out into the Black community to say, have you ever heard this? I began talking to health professionals and to just Black advocacy groups and things like that. I would show members of the Black community and leaders pictures of it. I said, you ever seen anybody that has this in their teeth? Oh yeah, sure, I've seen that. And are you aware of what caused it? No. Isn't that because they just didn't brush their teeth well? And there's this vast ignorance about it. And we began to ask CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and other groups, what have you done to specifically educate, for instance, the black community about this? And it was amazing, the reaction we got. They'll do anything to not talk about the fact that they have not shared this openly. Sure, they put it in a tiny little table buried in the back of a study that's in a publication that hardly anybody but us nerds look at, right, on the internet. And then we found out last fall, meaning the fall of '09, that there was a study in the Journal of Public Health Dentistry, a dental journal, that they concluded that black children are ingesting significantly more fluorides than white children. And so here's what we've got. We now have evidence that there is more exposure in the black community and significantly greater harm, meaning the dental fluorosis disfigurement. So you've got greater exposure and harm. A lot of people, and this is very sad, are so embarrassed and humiliated by what's on their teeth. They won't even allow us to take a picture of just the teeth and the lips. No identifying marks or anything above the lips or anything like that, or below the chin. There's a significant group of people who really need to have this information, whose lives have been devastated. They don't want to go on job interviews. They don't want to go on, their social interactions have been affected. Their personality is affected. And it goes way beyond, of course, members of the black community. Anyone who has dental fluorosis, this can be an issue. But we began to find that there's other economic issues, and now that there's been an admission that making baby formula with fluoridated city water, that parents might want to rethink that kind of idea because it may cause dental fluorosis. That information really hasn't been shared with the black community, with the white community, with moms in general. It just hasn't. So one of our emphases has been to deal with the issue of harm to the black citizens. And also because we got involved in the kidney impact issue. We were involved in getting the National Kidney Foundation to withdraw their endorsement of water fluoridation. And the black community is, of course, disproportionately harmed by kidney disease. So this is another reason why issue of the news about harm from fluoride should be shared openly. Infant formula is, to me, a really important issue because many people, as we're sitting here talking right now, they go to their sink. They don't have resources to get unfluoridated water or to get an expensive home water filtration system. And there's plenty of single parents right now and others who are just economically disadvantaged and others who just don't get the information of all social strata. They go to their kitchen sink to fill up to use the water for mixing their baby's milk formula. And the National Research Council said in 2006 in their report on fluorides that infants and children in our country are ingesting 3 to 4 times the amount of fluoride as adults are on a body weight basis. And this is really serious because babies and children's bodies the cells and tissues are growing and cells are dividing so rapidly. So, the impact is really significant. And the idea that it's only an issue for dental fluorosis in these children, that just flies against all sense of reason and common sense. Obviously, the fluoride doesn't just touch their teeth-forming cells. It's going into their brain-forming cells and all throughout their whole body. So we found that this issue is something that is really important for moms, for caregivers, for child caregivers. There's just so many people grandparents, parents, who should have this information, but because the Centers for Disease Control buried the information on this obscure web page and didn't bother to issue a press release when they changed their stance. I mean, to say that parents may wish to, if they're concerned about fluorosis, they may wish to avoid the fluoridated water. That's really very disingenuous, and that's being kind in how I express it. These are some of the most vulnerable of our society, little babies, whose entire lives from this point forward are being impacted by what happens as their body is forming. Who promotes fluorides and the use of fluorides in water fluoridation? At the beginning, when I started looking into this, I had certain ideas about who would be involved in this. There's obviously the people who historically have had interest in dealing with fluoride issues. You know, the manufacturers of certain manufacturing processes that had to deal with fluorides as a byproduct or inherent in what they were doing. But the issue of getting rid of the air pollutant emissions that come off of making fertilizer, phosphate fertilizers, and, you know, trying to turn something that's a liability, which going through a smokestack and landing on cows and crops and everything else around, you know, that was a liability. And now to be able to turn that into a marketable product, to collect it using these air pollution scrubbers, and then take that product and this liquor, if you will, and be able to, instead of having to dispose of it in a landfill, or instead of having to try to deal with the emissions issues in the air, to be able to sell it and basically just sort of disperse it into the public water system and into people's bodies. Talk about the ultimate way to take a problem and turn it into a positive, at least in terms of cash flow. And, you know, that's what occurred in this scenario. There's a lot of people who push fluorides for a number of different uses. And it's not just for water fluoridation. Obviously, it's used in oral care products and other things. I think and in fact I know this is what's going to occur, at some point the public is going to associate the term fluoride and recoil at the term the way they do when they hear the word arsenic. You know, you kind of think, ugh, when someone says the word arsenic. Well, you need to be thinking about fluoride that way because fluoride, because of its properties, it's a very dangerous chemical, certainly to be ingesting it over long-term and uncontrolled amounts. The future of water fluoridation is all downhill. This thing's going to collapse. Water fluoridation is a house of cards that is wobbling. It is going to collapse. It violates so many fundamental tenets of ethics, scientific study and practice, pharmacology, toxicology, and there's just a whole host of reasons, liability reasons and other things like this, to where it's obvious that water fluoridation is going to end. The only issue for me is how fast is it going to occur? There's going to be a lot of people who are going to be really, I think, concerned about their personal liability in this issue because many people knew better and they had the information and they didn't act. They allowed the pressures of their professional sort of societies and peers to cause them to compromise their morals, to compromise their scientific principles. And, you know, when the house of cards collapses, it's going to expose something that Americans maybe are not going to be real enthused about seeing. Because, you know, we as Americans, we want to believe that our doctors and our dentists and our public health system is really after our best interest. But when it comes right down to it, there's been an awful lot of influence exerted and money passed through, back and forth through sometimes legitimate channels. But when the money trail shows up and when the liability thing, when the smoke clears, there's going to be a lot of organizations and individuals and professionals who are going to wish that they had weathered the pressure put on them by pro-fluoride groups, because, you know, it's always better to, the truth, the funny thing, you know what the funny thing about truth is? After everything else is all collapsed around it, truth is still going to be standing. Truth doesn't need to be defended, but you know, it does help if we get ourselves in alignment with what's real and true. Truth is always going to be standing at the end of the game, but there are going to be people who are going to rue the day that they were just too concerned about what people were going to say about them and too concerned about the effect on their careers. Kidney patients should be told that fluorides accumulate more dramatically in their bones because their kidneys can't help excrete it out of their body. They have damaged function in that respect. And, you know, and there's other impacts inside their body. There's actual damage to the kidneys themselves, not just the bones. So that's just one small group. When you look at the numbers and crunch the numbers, look at this. You've got, what is it, 1 in 9 American adults has some form of kidney disease. Crunch the numbers. See how many potentially upset people there are. How many people are diabetics? And right now there's something like 50+ million pre-diabetics who they're thinking are going to convert many of them to diabetes. And the National Research Council said that diabetics, kidney patients, and seniors and infants among other groups, are a susceptible subpopulation that is particularly vulnerable to harm from ingested fluorides. So just crunch the numbers. This is going to dwarf asbestos and tobacco in the course because of the sheer numbers of people and the breadth of the conditions which are impacted by the fluorides. Back around 1999, 2000, when it came out formally so that the primary effect in preventing cavities was through topical means rather than systemic absorption. In other words, when the fluorides touch the teeth in the mouth, that is the primary. And that's very important to say. The dentists have admitted this is the primary, very key word, primary way that fluoride works. And they try to say now, well, there's both systemic and topical benefits. And they try to say it gets in your saliva and bathes your teeth topically, but the amount that's in, CDC knows this, and they've admitted, that the amount that's in the saliva is such a small amount, concentration, that it's really not going to have much impact in preventing cavities. So the very rationale that started fluoridation, which was systemic absorption, has been invalidated back in around 99, 2000. That should have ended fluoridation right there. That was enough to just end water fluoridation. Because the primary original rationale had been invalidated. But of course the story keeps changing, the target keeps moving, and they find other justifications to keep fluoride in there. Why? It's damage control, it's risk management, it's trying to find a way to justify things rather than to call a thing exactly the way it is. When I began to look into this to see the history of how water fluoridation began, I began to look to see what was the breadth of the types of studies that were done that justified the addition of fluoride into drinking water. And I began to find out that there was virtually no look-see at long-term low-dose effect on kidneys. No one had looked at thyroid and formally studied that, if thyroid impacts. And when you think of all the ladies, particularly today, that have hypothyroidism, I can tell you, I talked to a lot of these folks that have hypothyroidism, and they become white with anger when they find out the possibility, the fact that their thyroid condition may have been caused or exacerbated by fluorides. And that's very disturbing. So when I began to find out that this thing at the very beginning when they introduced it was mostly dental studies that were done, again, it just showed you that I think for the most part people, it wasn't like this large number of people trying to conspire to do this. People wanted to prevent cavities. They just did. And they had good intentions. The vast majority of people had good intentions. But that doesn't justify the fact that they did not look at whole body impacts and brain impacts. The National Research Council said in 2006 that more studies are needed on how fluoride impacts the human brain. I think they said to clarify the impact on the human brain. I actually have people come up to me after reading that and they say, wait a minute, you mean we fluoridate and we don't know what it does to the human brain? And they're blown away by that. And of course they should be. We do hear the CDC and other people talk just ad nauseum about how there's supposedly 60 years of studies showing fluoride to be safe and effective. And the interesting thing is that if that's true, then why did the National Research Council's report in 2006 come up with literally volumes of research that has never been done, that they say should be done on the impacts of fluorides? And it wasn't that they're not saying study high doses. Sometimes they're talking about study this at 1 part per million to 4 parts per million. Study it at low levels and varying levels. So I don't buy it when people say the National Research Council report has nothing to do with fluoridation. That report showed that it acknowledged that fluoridation began without really knowing what the impacts were going to be on kidney patients. So this idea that there's 60 years of studies, that's just simply not true. Let's just call it what it is. It's just not true. The vast majority of the people that are promoting this for the past number of few decades at least are really just, at least the dentists and doctors, they're just kind of in lockstep with the mothership, if you will. They're saying what their dental societies and medical societies give them to say. It's not that the vast majority of them are some sort of plotting people with malintent. Now there are some people, of course, who make money on this whole fluoride thing. There are dentists, and let's be real about it, the fastest growing sector of the dental industry, I'm told, is the cosmetic side of it, the cosmetic dentistry side of it. And yes, dentists do make money fixing dental fluorosis in people. And do they tell them that fluoride's caused it? In many cases, and the people we talk with, no, they were not told. People are under the impression that it was their lack of oral hygiene and taking care of their teeth and things like this. But this idea of how do you approach sharing the story, I don't find a lot of benefit, frankly, in going down roads and talking about these things that I can't prove, that they're these legends that are just kind of all over the internet in some places. But there is plenty of science now to end fluoridation. There just is. So there's also the ethics issues. There's economic issues. So we stick with those because they're real and provable. And I just encourage people to stick with the things that don't get you labeled, needlessly so, as somebody strange. I mean, look at me. I mean, I'm one of these people that dealt with radioactive materials, biologic agents, chemical hazards. I'm the former manager of the EPA Western Regional Lead Training Center. My career path was just normal and straight, you know, and graduate training in public health and emphasis in environmental health. And you know, there are people that will say, well, you're just using weird science, and they say worse things than that to me. But when they say that, you know, they don't address the specifics of what we say. They rely on endorsements. They rely on generalities. They don't deal with the specific science. They don't deal with the specific issues of dose that's uncontrolled, and what about safety margins and all these kind of things. They tend to want to shoot the messenger, and they tend to want to switch the subject, change it to something else, and use circular reasoning and logic. And frankly, you know, the days of that being effective are rapidly dwindling. And I'm really excited to say that, because I can see now that people are being called on the carpet more and more. And now that the attorneys are getting involved. I talk to attorneys all across the country with more and more regularity now, and they're waking up to this issue. That's really critical, that the people get put under oath who've been not telling the truth, who've been avoiding telling the truth. There are certain questions CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, they simply have refused to answer. They'll do anything besides answering these questions. They'll dance. They'll cite organizations that endorse what they're doing, but they won't answer some really key specific questions. How do you control the dose of fluoride that a person gets? How about this? How does a person find out how much is in their bones right now, today? Do they want to do a painful bone biopsy? No, they're not going to do that. You can't really know how much is in your pineal gland. You can't know how much is in your bones. You can't know some of these really important things. With water fluoridation, how are you going to, for the people that want to avoid getting the dental fluorosis and they don't have money to get a filtration system, they don't have money, you know, for their children I'm talking about, and they don't, or they want to avoid it for their home, who's going to pay? You know, there's a lot of these kinds of questions that people just have never been forced to answer, and when people get put under oath, watch what happens when some smart attorneys really press hard on the questions that no one has ever been forced to answer. I think this moment today, and as we're talking here, this is mid-2010, and what's going to happen? I think we're going to see a real acceleration of bad news about fluoride. It's all bad news. It's all downhill. I would not want to be promoting fluoride these days. I wouldn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. It's just, from a risk management standpoint, it's not worth the risk financially, to people's health, for litigation purposes, etc. The Lilly Center is a very small public health training firm, and we got pulled into it just because of this health impact that had happened to my boss. She believed in this so strongly that she mortgaged her house. And that's, you know, we're not backed by some big corporation or anything like that. We don't have, I maxed my credit cards, she mortgaged her house. And we began to just talk to people to see who it was, to educate ourselves, to find out who had the authority and the power to bring change. And we found out that there was this sort of chain of deferred authority all over the place, and no one really, this is a hot potato. No one wanted to be the one who sort of stood out first on it. You know how politicians, they don't want to get on board a train until they see which way the train is heading? That just irritates the heck out of me when they're supposed to be serving the public good. And we began to find out that many politicians just don't have a spine. They don't have morals. And so what we found out is we've just been, our approach is kind of very really, it's been to follow our intuition. I find in my life that even though I have all this scientific training, that my gut, my intuition is really the way to sort of steer how we go. That's how we got into this issue of kidneys and impact on kidney patients, and look what happened. We had, the National Kidney Foundation removed their endorsement. My boss said to me one day, she said, we really need to reach out to the black community. It's important to do that. She's not a member of the black community, but she just felt that inside her, intuition said that. So we did, and suddenly all these doors began to open. We began to talk to all kinds of really interesting and neat people in the black community, and we began to get endorsements towards ending fluoridation. I have letters from a very broad spectrum of influential people in the black community. This is something when people can see it. It's really crucial to be able to physically, visibly see the impact of fluorides. Otherwise, fluoridation and fluorides can sound kind of dry and abstract. It's just this chemical, people's eyes can roll back in their head when you start talking about chemicals. When we began to actually say, hey, let's start talking to people, show me your teeth, and looking at people's mouths when they were talking to us, striking up conversations. Yes, there's a lot of dental fluorosis that's out there. We think that as more and more people find out about this, and they find out the costs that's going to take to fix their teeth. If you get teeth veneers, I'm told that by a friend who's a cosmetic dentist that it can cost $100,000 over your lifetime to keep replacing these things about every 10 years or so. It's a real impact, and it affects people's personality development, their social skills. I had a young lady, she was so candid with us. Just so candid. She said, this is just going to break a lot of people's hearts if this continues, because she talked about how it had impacted her. And my heart just went out to her. I know there's plenty of other stuff that we all have to deal with, in life here. But this is something this is a no-brainer. We need to end water fluoridation.
Paul Connett, Professor Emeritus of Chemistry from St. Lawrence University in Canton, New York, and now the Executive Director of the Fluoride Action Network. 14 years ago, my wife put a bundle of papers down on my table and said, "Dear, would you read these?" And I said, "What is it?" And she said, "Fluoride, fluoridation." I said, "Take that stuff away. These people are crazy." At that time, I felt that fluoridation was all cut and dried, it was safe, it worked well for teeth and so on, no problems. After I read the papers, the scientific papers, I was really rather humbled and embarrassed, because I realized that this impression that I was walking around with, that there was no issue here, there was no debate, was clearly not true. There were very serious questions. One of the issues that concerned me greatly was how low the level of fluoride is in mother's milk. It's actually as low as 0.004 parts per million, which means that a bottle-fed baby in a fluoridated community where the parents make up the formula with fluoridated tap water is going to get 250 times more fluoride than a breastfed baby. And I felt then, and I feel now, that nature wouldn't have screwed up on something as fundamental as what a baby needed for healthy growth. And as I read more, I realized that there were some serious health concerns here. And as I read still more, it was clear that there was no difference in tooth decay between fluoridated and non-fluoridated countries. And also, even though most people have been persuaded that everybody is doing it, and you could argue that most people are doing this in the United States, but most people in the world are not doing it. Most countries are not fluoridated. 98% of Europe is not fluoridated. The majority of countries are not fluoridated. In fact, there's only 8 countries in the world that have more than 50% of their water fluoridated. So the odd men out are the people that fluoridate. If you get chance to talk to an audience with an open mind, an audience that's prepared to listen, it doesn't take very long to persuade them that this is a very silly practice. it's bad. It's a bad medical practice. When you think about it, once you put it in the water, you can't control the dose. Once you put it in the water, you can't control who gets it, which means the very young, the very old, the very sick, the people with impaired kidney function, the people with poor diet. And also, there is no individual supervision. There's no doctor checking to see if there's any side effects. And if you believe in fluoridation, that you believe that there's this single drug in the world that has no side effects. It would be absolutely remarkable if fluoride had no side effects. And the only way they're able to maintain this very unlikely position is that they're not doing comprehensive health studies in the United States to see if communities that are fluoridated are experiencing greater health problems. Are they experiencing arthritis? That's important because there is an increase in arthritis in the United States, and we know that the first symptoms of fluoride's damage to the bone is just like arthritis, pains in the joints, in the bones themselves. Another thing that's associated with fluoride is lowered thyroid function. Again, we have a huge epidemic of hypo-underactive thyroid gland in the United States with symptoms like lethargy, chronic fatigue, depression, obesity, and so on. All of these things are all around us, but nobody is checking to see if there's any relationship between people drinking fluoridated water their whole lives. By the way, that's another reason why fluoridation is so preposterous. You are giving a drug to people for them to drink every day of their lives for the rest of their lives. I mean, it is, quite frankly, it's one layer of preposterousness on top of another. And to top it all, to make it a very clear case of bad medicine, you're not giving people informed consent. You're allowing a whole community to do to everyone what an individual doctor can do to no one. An individual doctor cannot force a patient to take medicine. They are required to tell them the benefits and the downside, the side effects. And once the patient has heard these, then they are supposed to make up their own mind. We haven't given our consent to this. To me, it's the height of arrogance. We are meant to believe that just because they put on a white coat and tell you that they're the experts, that we have to take this medicine. It's absolute nonsense. And the other thing which is preposterous about this is a dentist has skills on teeth. We go to dentists for them to drill and polish and do other things with our teeth. Those dentists are not trained. They're not specialists in the brain, in the bone, in the thyroid gland, in the lung, in the kidney, into hypersensitivity, into margin of safety analysis, into risk assessment, in toxicology. They don't have any of the skills which will enable them to go to the public and say it is safe. They haven't done the reading, they don't have the skills. It's, as I say, it's the height of arrogance. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention only has one division involved with the fluoridation issue, and this is the Oral Health Division. About 30 staff. If you look at their qualifications, they're nearly all dentally trained, and their function is to promote fluoridation. It's been the policy of the US Public Health Service to endorse fluoridation and promote fluoridation since 1950. And all they're doing is to promote it. And they do it very aggressively. They send their personnel to state legislatures and support mandatory fluoridation. So they're very aggressive and enthusiastic about this practice, and they promote it. And therefore they have a huge conflict of interest when it comes to a question of whether this practice that they have promoted for 60 years, whether they have a conflict of interest when they tell you that the process is effective and safe. This is what is very peculiar, because as the evidence of effectiveness gets weaker and weaker, as they admit now that the mechanism, they got the mechanism wrong for over 50 years. For over 50 years they thought that the baby had to swallow the fluoride and the fluoride would be incorporated in the growing enamel. So when the teeth erupted through the gums, they would be harder and more protected against acid attack. They now say no, that doesn't work that way. It works topically, it works from the outside of the tooth. So they've changed the mechanism. Well, as this evidence for lack of benefit and the evidence of harm gets stronger, they seem to want to fluoridate more. They seem to, right now, they want to introduce mandatory fluoridation in Oregon, in Pennsylvania. They've talked about Massachusetts. They've just got it through Louisiana. They've just got it through Nebraska, mandatory fluoridation. In Australia, they've just got mandatory fluoridation through in Queensland. In Victoria, they're forcing it on communities without even giving them a chance to vote on it. And it's puzzling why they continue to promote this so aggressively. And a lot of people have asked, you know, where's the money in this? Follow the money. Well, it's difficult, you know, which there are many industrial interests that use fluoride. They may be worried about liability. We have sugar interests. They've always wanted to reduce tooth decay without reducing sugar consumption. So for them, fluoride was the magic bullet. We have the pharmaceutical industry and others using fluoride in dental products. They may be worried about liabilities. The American Dental Association may be worried also about liabilities because they've endorsed these fluoridated products, and if it's shown that fluoridated water causes problems, then all these other products are also liable. But I think the real issue here is loss of credibility. I think the US Public Health Service and all its minions, the NIH, the Department of Health and Human Services, the CDC and so on, have all promoted fluoridation so aggressively, so enthusiastically. Every Surgeon General has endorsed fluoridation since 1950. And I think now they feel that if they admit that they were wrong, that this is going to harm their other public health projects. My advice to them is the way to minimize liabilities is to stop fluoridation in the name of the precautionary principle. That way you don't admit to anything. You're not saying we think that fluoride damages bones and that's why we're stopping, because if you did it that way, then the lawyers would be jumping up and down across the country and having lawsuits for everybody who's had a hip fracture, everybody's got arthritis, everybody's got lowered thyroid function. So I think that's the way. As you know, Bill Hersey at the EPA said it very well. He says they're riding a tiger and they don't know how to get off. You know, they've told everybody for years that it's safe and effective, and it's neither, but they don't know how to admit up to that. But as I say, I think a careful application of the precautionary principle would get them out of a tight corner. You've got two choices. Either they're aware, but they're frightened of telling the public and admitting this, or they're totally, utterly incompetent. They can't read. I mean, all you've got to do is to read the literature. The open literature, there's a lot on fluoride's damage to the bone. There's a huge amount of literature now on fluoride's damage to the brain. And incidentally, there is no argument about fluoride's ability to damage the body. It's a known highly toxic substance. Millions of people worldwide have had their bones wrecked and other tissues impacted by natural fluoride. We've known forever that it interferes with enzymes, interferes with other aspects of biology and biochemistry. And it's also very clear and well established in literally hundreds of articles from India and China and other parts of the world which have high natural levels, that people's lives have been ruined by exposure to fluoride. Skeletal fluorosis, damage to the brain, damage to the kidney and other things, well established. The only argument that's left is there an adequate margin of safety between the levels which cause this harm in the literature and the levels at which people are exposed in a fluoridated community? Now, I would state quite clearly and categorically that there is no adequate margin of safety to protect everyone in society drinking fluoridated water. So it's a practice that should be ended as soon as possible. And it's not as if we don't know that it's harming people. There are 32% of American children, and this is a study conducted by the Center for Disease Control in 2005, admits that 32% of American children have dental fluorosis, which indicates that they've been overexposed to fluoride, not just in fluoridated water, but from all sources of fluoride, dental products, air pollution, some foodstuffs, and of course fluoride in water, and also fluoride in the foods and beverages which have been prepared with fluoridated water. You add all that up, and our kids are being overexposed to fluoride. And their gamble, though, as they said that dental fluorosis is a cosmetic effect, nonsense. It's the first indication that the body is being poisoned by fluoride. And the open question is what other tissues have been damaged. You know, as far as thyroid function is concerned, doctors in Europe between the 1930s and the 1950s used to give patients sodium fluoride tablets to lower the activity of the thyroid gland. What's it going to do to somebody who's has normal thyroid function, or someone who's already got low thyroid function or borderline thyroid function? I think it's reasonable to suggest that it could make things worse, and yet they're not looking at that. It's reprehensible, it's irresponsible, but it all goes to point to the fact that right now they're more interested in protecting this policy and their credibility than they are interested in protecting the health of the citizens of this country and the other citizens in other fluoridated countries. The EPA has no jurisdiction per se over water fluoridation because they don't have any jurisdiction over the additives, the chemicals added to water. That comes under the National Sanitation Foundation, a private entity, would you believe. What the EPA does is to regulate pollutants or contaminants of the water. They set a safe standard for any contaminant, any material that's likely to end up in the water when water percolates through rocks. So there's a standard for arsenic, there's a standard for lead, and there is also a standard for fluoride. And since 1986, that standard has been 4 parts per million. And the National Research Council, who did their review at the request of the EPA and funded by the EPA, after 2.5 years came back and said the 4 parts per million standard is not protective of health, and you should do a new health risk assessment to determine a safe MCLG. MCLG stands for maximum contaminant level goal. That is the safe standard based upon the best science with an appropriate safety margin put in to protect everyone, because the Safe Drinking Water Act should protect everyone, the standard. Well, after 4 years plus, the EPA has not done that, and yet the calculations are relatively simple. The National Research Council did all the work that they were requested to do. Nearly all the endpoints that they need are there. The levels which cause those endpoints are there. All they have to do is to take those endpoints and apply standard procedures, and if they would do that, then the MCLG that they would come up with would be far less than 1 part per million. And of course, if they did that, it's the end of water fluoridation. So the EPA, if they did their job, would be able to end water fluoridation tomorrow. But you can imagine in Washington, if that happened, it would be like a volcano from the US Public Health Service. So right now we believe that the US Public Health Service is trying to keep the lid on the EPA to not, or delay and delay and delay that final determination of the MCLG. Well, you know, in the last couple of years we have a new president, and one of the things that President Obama has said is, I want to see scientific integrity and transparency in our regulatory agencies. I want them to do their jobs honestly because of all the scandals about industry influence and pressure, the pharmaceutical industry on NIH and CDC and so on. And so what we need is for President Obama to match this beautiful sounding rhetoric with reality, and the quickest place to do that is with the EPA. So we need President Obama to say to the EPA, do your job. Do your job scientifically, do your job honestly, let's have a safe MCLG, and one extra thing, I will protect any scientist at the EPA that does this honest job. You will not be fired under my watch. You won't lose your pension, you won't lose your promotion, you won't be fired, you won't be harassed or penalized in any way. And it's sad to have to even suggest that that might be necessary, but we've had situations in the past where scientists at the EPA have been fired because they were outspoken on aspects of fluoride's toxicity. So there we have it. We could be ending fluoridation tomorrow if the EPA did its job, or even more importantly, if the President of the United States instructed the EPA to do its job and protect the American people, and instead of trying to protect the backsides of the bureaucrats working in the US Public Health Service. It's not just the future of water fluoridation that I'm concerned about. I am concerned about the future role of honest science in government. And I think that's the serious thing. When you drive a wedge between honest science and public health policy, and the public's trust I don't think we can afford to lose any more the public's trust on our agencies. I think the public has lost trust in politicians. I think now everybody believes that politicians, spin things. They have agencies, PR firms, which spin everything. But I think the average citizen expects, and certainly has the right to expect, that the bureaucrats that are working in these regulatory agencies do not spin, do not massage the data, that they do everything honest that they can, so that when they provide the reports to the political leaders, the leaders have the best science in front of them. They shouldn't be provided reports which have been spun by external interests. In our case, spun by the dental lobby, or spun by the people that don't want to give up this practice from the US Public Health Service. So now that we have a politician who claims that he wants scientific integrity, we need that to be demonstrated. We need it pretty quickly so that we can begin to regain the trust of the American people in the EPA, in the FDA, in the CDC, in the NIH, and all the other agencies, that it's our money to protect them. If they want to go and work for industry, let industry pay their wages. But as long as we're paying their wage packet, we want honest science. If you don't have honesty in science, you don't have science. And if you don't have science, you really don't have a credible public health policy. The Canadian Dental Association is on record as recommending that patients do not use supplements for fluoride for babies. The ADA recommends that parents not use fluoridated water to make up baby formula. They haven't made much of an effort to get that information to the public. But it's very clear that they have conceded that the major benefit of fluoride is topical, not systemic. Meanwhile, they also know that the dental fluorosis is a systemic effect, and we also worried about other effects. So why on earth would you expose the baby's developing tissues to a known toxic substance for which the benefits of the treatment are topical, and you've got other methods of achieving it, and for which all the risks are systemic? It simply does not make sense. And if a doctor recommends that, then they should be told very politely, you should go and read the literature. Simply read the literature. But unfortunately, the doctors and dentists, by and large, are extremely busy with their practices, and they don't have time to read the literature, and rather they simply rely on recommendations by agencies and associations which have, if you like, a stake in promoting this practice. The ADA is very much involved in this, promoting this practice, and so is the CDC. So you're not getting objectivity from these agencies, but these are agencies that normally, and the AMA for that matter, the AMA takes its cue from the ADA. So the AMA takes its cue from the ADA, and the doctors take their cue from the AMA, the dentists take their cue from the ADA, and everybody takes their cue from the CDC. And the only way out of this is for doctors, dentists, and scientists to read the literature. And after 14 years, I got so frustrated with this because it's so difficult to get this information out in sound bites, in letters to the editor, TV interviews, and so on, because they won't debate it publicly. I mean, I'm not making this up. It's in the literature. There's been some extremely important cases, and I will give you 3 of them, of where people that have been aggressively, actively, professionally promoting of fluoridation and have read the literature and changed their position. The first one was John Cahoon, who was the principal dental officer for Auckland, New Zealand, and was a prime promoter of fluoridation in that country. And he went on a world tour, and he found out behind the scenes that the researchers were telling them they were finding no difference in tooth decay between fluoridated and non-fluoridated communities. And he had the grace to change his mind and actively work against it. Same with Hardy Lineback, who was the former president of the Canadian Association for Dental Research, was a spokesperson for the Canadian Dental Association on fluoridation. He did the same thing. He read the literature. The thing that triggered it for him was discovering that the fluoride that they were using in water plants is not pharmaceutical grade that you get in toothpaste, but it is an industrial hazardous waste product which comes from the phosphate fertilizer industry, which is not allowed to be dumped into the sea they allow us to put it into our water. So he's been very important. In fact, Hardy Lineback was on the National Research Council report I've referred to earlier. And the third person is Bill Osmondson, a dentist who practices in both Washington and Oregon State. He had promoted fluoridation for 25 years. He too read the literature, has changed his position, and now is actively working to help his colleagues and the public try to stop this practice. The people that promote fluoridation have had a very simple strategy for over 60 years. Their strategy is to keep scientists, dentists, and doctors away from the primary literature, away from the scientific literature. And they do that in two ways. One is they claim authority for themselves. They put on those white coats and they use endorsements. This agency endorses fluoridation. They give you about 100 agencies that endorse fluoridation. And so we're meant to believe that the overwhelming number of scientists and dentists and doctors, they all endorse fluoridation. So authority, they say, is on their side. But they don't back this up with solid science. And then they also buttress this with reviews. They get their dummy panels, self-selected panels, selected to produce rubber stamp reviews to demonstrate that fluoridations are safe and effective. But the one that got away was the National Research Council. This was the first one where we had a truly balanced panel, and they came back with serious questions which could eventually overthrow fluoridations. But the one half of it is that we are the authority, we have the endorsements. And the other part of their strategy to keep people away is to ridicule the opponents. We are supposed to be junk scientists. We get our information from the internet. We are emotional. We are anything but scientific. Which side is presenting the more solid scientific case, and which side is prepared to go public and defend that case in public and prepared to debate that case in open public debate? And you'll find the answer to those questions. It's the opponents of fluoridation that will go public. It's the opponents of fluoridation who make the science transparent and give all the references, and the opponents who will debate the issue in public. And it's the proponents who will not make the scientific studies available, will not support the studies that haven't been done, make sure that they do get done, who won't go on a public platform and debate this issue with us. In February of 2003, the US EPA invited me to debate the issue in Washington at their annual science fair, which goes on for a week. They always have one controversial issue which is debated. And right away I said, yes, I'll debate anybody. They spent the next 5 weeks trying to find one person from either the ADA or any of the agencies that endorse fluoridation in the United States. They couldn't find one single person with 5 weeks' notice to come to Washington and debate this issue in front of the EPA and the public. Not one, not one. It gives you some idea. The irony, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that they have to do is to come to the public with enormous confidence. I mean, when you're promoting public health, you cannot show any deviation from total confidence. You can't come out it half-hearted. But there's such a gross juxtaposition of this enormous confidence when in a solo platform they promote fluoridation with enormous enthusiasm, and the lack of confidence when it comes to defending their position against someone like myself, and I'm not the only one, on a public platform. I don't think the ethics is complicated. I think the notion of using the public water supply to deliver medication is so preposterous, and denying informed consent to everyone that's not difficult. I think everybody can realize quickly. Ask any pharmacist. Would you ever deliver medication where you couldn't control the dose? No. Would you ever deliver medication and give it to everybody regardless of age, health, or what have you? No. Would you ever give a medication which hasn't been prescribed by a doctor? No. Would you ever give medication that doesn't have a doctor's supervision somewhere to check side effects? No. Would you give medication without the patient's informed consent? No, 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 no. So that, I think, is very straightforward. This is bad medicine, and it's bad ethics. And the AMA is very, very clear about the necessity for getting informed consent when you're giving drugs to people. How many arguments do you need before you say, no, this is not a good idea? We know we've never done it with anything else. We've never used the public water supply to deliver a vitamin, to deliver heart medicine or aspirin or many other things, statins. There are many other things where maybe some doctors would want everybody to get a small dose of these drugs or vitamins, but they've never ever done it with anything but fluoride. Fluoride got in there early, but it never established a precedent for doing it with anything else. And I think that tells you a lot. To demonstrate that a substance is a nutrient, you have to starve the animal or the human being of that nutrient. You have to remove that nutrient from the diet and then demonstrate that some disease happens because the animal's not getting enough of this thing. If you can't demonstrate that, then you're not dealing with an essential nutrient. Fluoride is not needed for any tissue in the body. Instead of this being one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century, what it actually is, one of the top 10 public health frauds of the 20th century. And I don't use those words lightly. Let me say it again. Fluoridation is one of the 20th century's top public health frauds. This story could have been written by Kafka or Lewis Carroll or Hans Christian Andersen. The emperor has no clothes, remember? I know we're right, and I'm not prepared to keep quiet when I see an injustice here. And I've also been very inspired by the people that have come before me and the people at the grassroots level that are actively working days and days of their lives, unpaid and often insulted, often digging deep into their own monies. There's a lot of good people working on this, and we're all pretty determined to have justice done and seen to be done. And the last thing that we're prepared to do is to lose this by default. If you want to win this argument with us, then do it in open debate. Do it by answering our scientific questions with scientific answers with all the references attached. Under those circumstances, if those arguments are stronger than ours and we've been based on wrong science, if we've made mistakes and we're wrong, then I'd be glad to admit it. But we're not going to accept this by default. We're not going to genuflect before pompous names, or names, these big names, or just because they wear a white coat and say they're the president of this or the president of that or the archbishop of this church or what have you. That's not the way science is done. That was the way science was done in Galileo's time, when the Pope told Galileo, get down on your knees and tell me you don't see sunspots when you look through a telescope. You can't do that anymore. Authorities cannot tell scientists what to find. You have to base your science on what you find, on observations, on data, not on political theories or upholding a policy. That's not science. It doesn't make sense to drink it, to put it inside your body if it works topically. If it works topically, then brush your teeth with toothpaste, fluoridated toothpaste. But don't drink it. Don't expose every tissue in the body, and for that matter, don't expose people that don't want it. It makes as much sense to put fluoride into people's drinking water as it would to swallow sun lotion. You would be laughed out of court if you suggested that. And in the same token, people that suggest putting this known toxic substance that works topically, if at all, into the drinking water, which is inviting systemic exposure to every tissue in the body, that also should be laughed out of court. As I said before, the emperor has no clothes.